So welcome everybody to our webinar this morning. This is a new conversation as a webinar topic because it's not so much about the work that we do or about the findings of a particular study, but it's about the way that we work and the way that the work of the Williams Institute and other people that fulfill the role of experts and academics fit in with other work that's going on in the LGBTI advocacy community. Experts can be important contributors in public policy debates, but there's some considerations and limitations in the role of experts. And there are some particular advantages and very powerful moments that can come from the use of experts in advocacy for LGBTI rights. I thought that this conversation was important because I see experts being used more and more frequently in debates about LGBTI rights around the world. And I think there are a few reasons why the use of experts is becoming more frequent and more common. One is that more sectors are taking up LGBTI issues. Therefore, the movement needs sector expertise in particular systems that are very complicated, such as child welfare systems, corporate labor forces, international refugee flows, behavioral change modification things for health, etc. So as LGBTI issues become more deeply embedded in complicated systems, expertise becomes more important. There's also more research being conducted about LGBTI populations. So there's frankly more to be expert on. There's more findings, there's more work being done to sort out stereotypes from truth. So there's a higher level of knowledge to be drawn upon by experts. And also as the LGBTI people make the case that LGBTI rights are about facts and actual lived experiences rather than simple moral conclusions or culturally being dismissed, you need experts to help sort out the facts from the stereotypes. But one thing that has struck me globally is the weight with which scientific knowledge about human beings and human development crosses borders. So that if we're talking about sexuality or human interactions, relationships, etc., a study done in one country can be seen as applicable and relevant in other countries as well. So I think it's good to have this kind of discussion about how we work together. And for that, we have two of, I think, the very best panelists on this topic. Lee Badgett has been with the Williams Institute for some time, but is also a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's a professor of economics. And I think in terms of issues dealing with LGBT employment and labor issues and the broader question of how much money does it cost to be able to discriminate against somebody, or does it cost a government, or does it cost an economy to have discrimination take place, Lee is, I think, without a doubt, the most cited expert in the world on these issues. We also have Michael Stambaugh. He's right now an assistant professor at the University Bordeaux-Montaigne, I guess. He's a cultural sociologist, and he received his PhD from UCLA, where he studied the use of experts in various cultural settings, particularly comparing the use of experts in the same-sex marriage debates in the United States and in Europe, mostly France. So he has looked at this issue from the perspective of addressing certain research questions about how experts work. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through essentially 5 questions or 5 issues, and I'm going to ask first Lee and then Michael to pitch in on each one. And basically, here are the 5 questions. One is, what do experts do? How do they fit in? The second is, from the perspective of experts, what are the considerations about the use of experts in advocacy? Why are they valued? When are they not valued? Who can be an expert? Who shouldn't be an expert? The third question is, from the perspective of advocates, what are the considerations for the role of experts in LGBTI advocacy? How do you find an expert? What are the boundaries between an expert and an advocate? How do you structure that relationship so it's productive and useful? Then the fourth question is, how do we respond to opposition experts? And then the fifth is, I've asked the panelists to give examples of any of the concepts that we've talked about. What I would like the participants on the call to do is to go ahead and type in the Q&A section if you have your little chat box open. And if possible, in terms of selecting a recipient, just select a recipient that goes to as many people as possible. So I might actually interrupt the panelists between questions to kind of give them questions that I'm seeing you asking. And if Lee and Michael, if you're able to see some of those chat things, go ahead and address them as you wish. Okay, so why don't we kind of review the controls. If you could give me here we go. So we're gonna mute everybody. If you want to mute yourself, you can press *6. If you want to unmute yourself, you can press *7, and you can also raise your hand through the little web thingy or type something. Don't put the call on hold if you're on a phone. Hang up and call back. All right, so enough for instructions. Why don't we go to the first set of questions and okay, here we go. So, whoops. Sorry, I'm trying to get the slide 3 here. Oh, here we go. So, Lee and Michael, can you tell us, what do experts do? I mean, how do experts fit into advocacy strategies? Tell us a little bit about what you think, and let's start with Lee.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
All good on my end.
Andrew? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, these webinars are always interesting as we speak out into the void. Well, thanks for inviting me to be here today to talk about this, because I think it's really important that researchers or people who you might think of as experts have better relationships with people in the advocacy world. In a lot of ways, we live in somewhat different worlds in our day-to-day jobs. I'm sitting here in my office, and later I'm going to go to a seminar and get my class ready for next week and do some grading and lots of other bureaucratic things that I have to do. You know, so we probably have more in common than we think. So I guess I want to start by just saying that many people in the academic world, or people who go into research, and that's what I think of as being, you know, the type of experts that we're talking about here, really want to do work that is important and relevant, not just in our very limited academic worlds, but more broadly. And so I think that's probably, if I can convince you of that, that might be the most important thing here, and that it's worth your while to get to know us better. So what can we do? What can we contribute? Well, I think the research that Andrew mentioned about the issues related to children being raised by LGBT parents is a great example. that whole body of research came out of claims that were made in cases, tragic cases in the U.S. in the 70s and 80s and continue on to this day about the custody of children when their parents are LGBT. And it started with a few psychologists, and now there are many, many, many studies of that nature that have pretty much universally shown that the kids raised by LGBT parents do quite well. I can say that that's a good example of something that academics do well. They are good at taking a claim that somebody makes about the world, and in this case, debunking that claim, the idea that, you know, LGBT people are mentally ill and will do something harmful to their kids. I would say the other, in addition to debunking claims that are made, we're very good at identifying problems. We work with data about people's lives, about their economic well-being, their health, their family situations, the kinds of challenges that they might face. And we can look at that data. We do look at that data on many LGBT issues, and we find problems, that there are, you know, that certain kinds of mental or physical health conditions are more common for LGBT people than they are for the rest of the population, or that LGBT people in some cases are more likely to be poor, or they get paid less than similar heterosexual or cisgender people. So we can point to things that might help advocates make their case. We can also study solutions. How well do policies work in changing the well-being of LGBT people? So those are, just kind of stop there and say that those are the kinds of things that, from the sort of social science that I do as an economist and a lot of people do, those are things that we're probably best at doing. The last thing I'll just add very quickly is that we have skills that might be useful beyond that, beyond what we apply to our own direct research projects, but that might be helpful for evaluating programs or projects that advocacy groups might take on, for giving advice about what the academic literature says about how to craft a good message will be effective and change people's minds, sorts of things. So I think there are lots and lots of different kinds of roles that academics can play.
Michael?
Yeah. First of all, I want to just say thank you as well for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here because it's nice to give back to the Williams Institute, because my research that I conducted involved doing archival research in France and the United States, but also conducting about 71 interviews with people involved in providing testimony to courts and legislatures in both countries. And a lot of those people in the United States were connected to lots of different think tanks, one of which was the Williams Institute. So the Williams Institute was very helpful when I was conducting the research to put me in touch with some of the different kinds of people, lawyers, social scientists, and others. So it's nice to be able to give back. What I noticed in my research is that in general, so this is sort of like the general edition of what experts do, is that they provide some kind of testimony or advice or information that's usually drawn from their own professional experience or their own personal research, or it's information about the state of affairs in their field in general. I think the key thing to keep in mind is that the kind of information that experts provide, whether it be to testify as expert witnesses in court cases, or whether it be writing a report or providing information to a legislative committee or an organization, or whether or not it's speaking out to the press, for example, the value of what experts say and the potential that it has to make an impact on changing laws or on changing public opinion is related to the context in which they're speaking, both institutionally and culturally. So different kinds of experts matter in different places, and I'll be a little bit more specific about that as the webinar goes along. Also, generally speaking, and you said this earlier, Andrew, experts really are involved in providing a kind of legitimacy to either back up a claim that's being made, or a kind of scientific legitimacy that is brought to debunk a claim that's made by somebody else. So that's also something that that Lee mentioned. And experts provide this kind of legitimacy because of who they are. They're recognized as having some kind of qualifications because of their professional status. In terms of the specific ways I noticed experts being involved in both countries, I noticed a variety of activities that were either really visible or less visible. In some of the most visible ways that experts were involved were being invited by litigators to testify in trials as expert witnesses. That was perhaps one of the most visible ways. Another way was by helping to write amicus briefs in support of one side or the other. And briefs are really important in judicial systems, like in the United States, that have common law, but are less significant in other countries like France. Experts can be also involved or asked to provide testimony by attorneys who've been asked to provide information to adjudicating bodies. This is particularly the case in the European Court of Human Rights, where sometimes attorneys don't get to provide oral arguments, or even if they do, they get to provide written arguments in which they can include a lot of scientific data to back up their claims, and so they will call on experts to give them that information. Experts can also testify before legislative committees, and whether or not they're asked to testify, say before Congress or before the California legislature or the French legislature, really depends on the rules in place. Some legislatures allow anybody to talk, and in others it's going to be the lawmakers themselves who invite experts. Also, one thing that people don't think about too much is that experts can write editorials in the media or letters to the editor, or they can go on television, or they can be called by journalists to provide quotes for articles that they're working on. And then there are a couple of hidden ways in which experts can be involved that happen behind the scenes. One of the ways, and this is particularly the case in countries like France and other European countries, where social scientists can be involved with political parties in an unofficial way, and function as kind of like the go-to person for information about, say, family law. So in France, there was this famous sociologist who was very connected to the Socialist Party, and at first she was against same-sex marriage. And she was one of the reasons why the Socialist Party took a pretty tepid response to legalizing same-sex marriage. And as she changed her opinion as a sociologist, she also was instrumental in helping to change the Socialist Party's platform on legalizing same-sex marriage. And all of that happened behind the scenes. I also found evidence of experts working behind the scenes, especially law professors and social scientists, working with organizations that are against LGBT rights, particularly the Catholic Church, providing them with information that they could use in public debates that was palatable. So whereas the Catholic Church can, of course, talk about the Bible or other religious arguments, the church found that those arguments were getting less and less traction. And so they called on law professors and social scientists that were their allies to help them to provide information that was grounded in, or at least had the appearance of being social science, to make their claims not through the Bible, but through other kinds of evidence. So again, seeking that legitimacy. And then finally, and I'll end here, I think that experts are involved in a non-visible way that is tangentially or indirectly related to public change, and that is by creating change in their own disciplines. So Lee talked about this, about how, in the past, in the 1970s, there was really very little to no research on same-sex couples and their children. And it's thanks to the innovation of certain people working in certain fields, in this example, psychology, that conducting research shifted the perspective of the field in general over time. And when a large field like psychology shifts and includes research on minorities, that can have a broader impact socially, because it can shape the way in which people perceive issues and the way in which those issues are talked about by the media and others.
Thank you, Michael. And I encourage people, if you have questions or just reactions to what you're hearing, go ahead and type them in the chat box. And so the next topic that I'd like the speakers to address are the considerations when discussing experts. Who is an expert? What do we mean when we talk about independence, and why is that important? are experts part of the movement, or are they outside of the movement? And what cross-culturally, what expertise is valued, and can a non-academic or a person who doesn't publish in peer-reviewed blah 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 also be an expert? So let me turn it over to Lee.
Yeah, I think that last point that you made, I think, is a really interesting one. And I think, I guess the way that I'm most comfortable using kind of this term expert in this context is really in the more formal sense where, as Michael put it, certain kinds of people can provide legitimacy, and other people who may know a lot about a particular topic, who have lived, their own lives, are certainly the experts about kind of their own lives. So yes, I was using the term expert as kind of it's a tricky thing. But I think that I'm thinking about who is an expert. Mostly we are thinking about people who have certain kinds of training or certain kinds of positions, both of which provide a useful perspective on some important question. And that might be, it might be somebody who's formerly an academic, a professor, and usually the advantage of a professor is that they do have a sense of a kind of social respect that is a resource for people who are in that position. And I hope that they use it wisely and use it to the social good. I certainly know many people who have. But I think what we're thinking of are people who have that kind of respect, who can provide legitimacy. And so in that sense, we want people who are not seen primarily as advocates. It does not mean that the so-called expert cannot have an opinion about a subject. In fact, that is what usually in these contexts they are asked to provide, is their opinion. But the basis for the opinion is coming from the body of research that they've conducted or that they're a part of in a larger kind of professional culture. And I think that professional culture is something important to understand. It means that people are going to be thinking not just about how what they say sounds to a judge or to a legislator or to somebody in a community organization, but they're also thinking about whether they could defend that to their colleagues in whatever field they're in. In my case, I know I have to be able to answer to economists because they're going to be reading work that I'll ask them to review, and I want them to think that I'm still kind of a legitimate economist doing work according to the norms of what constitutes good research. And so one of the big things is I think to me the biggest question is, am I being asked to am I being asked to answer a question, or am I being asked to give a particular answer to that question when an advocate is asking me to do something? And I make this distinction because I've heard both of these things in many cases. I used to get calls from people in different states in the U.S. saying, could you do a study showing that we'll lose hundreds of millions of dollars if we don't recognize same-sex marriage? And I would say, no, I can't do that. I can do a study to ask the question and provide you an answer with how much, if any, you might lose on net. And that was an important qualification because there was at least one time when we did a study of a particular state where we found something different from what we had found in other states. We mostly found that on net, governments would save money, businesses would save money, and would actually gain from more weddings. But in one particular state, because of a particular configuration of policies that they already had or didn't have related to LGBT people and same-sex couples, their state budget would actually have had a very small negative effect if they had recognized same-sex marriage. So it's important to me to be able to answer the question using the methods from my discipline that have been developed to answer those kinds of questions. So I would not have been comfortable, doing anything otherwise. So I think that's one question. Now, the question about, does that mean you can be part of a movement or not? Well, of course, professors have opinions. We vote. We tell other people about our opinions. But we also want to not be seen as being exactly the same as an advocate. The line is fuzzy. It's a very tricky thing for some people. For me, I've been working with the Williams Institute pretty much from its beginning, and have often been asked, well, aren't you an advocate? Isn't that what you do? And I answer this question in different ways depending on who I'm talking to. But the main thing is, no, what I spend my days doing are teaching students and doing research. I'm not there lobbying legislators. I'm not filing, briefs for a client like lawyers might do. My job is really to do research on these topics. And once I've done that research, then I might form an opinion, or I might use that research to support an opinion that I already had. But any opinions that I'm going to give you will be supported by kind of the best judgment about what the research tells us in my particular field. So I think it is a tricky thing, because my whole career I have kind of worked on issues of LGBT issues, because I think that it's a good thing for people to be treated fairly and equally. I think there are a lot of good reasons to do that, and my research, I think, supports that claim as well, that fairness and equality are good things socially, as well as for LGBT people specifically, and then they're good, and that fairness and equality and inclusion are also good things economically. They're good for economies too. So I make those arguments in those kinds of contexts, rather than saying, I'm a lesbian, treat me fairly, it's the right thing to do. I believe that's true, but that's not the argument that I'm going to make.
And Lee, if you could address Janice's question, what about academics with histories of activism, somebody who's been on the board of directors of an advocacy group, or been a volunteer, or maybe given some money at a dinner, so their name is on the web as a contributor? How can somebody like that still be an independent expert?
Sure, definitely. I think again, it's a question about what you do, rather than, it's not simply having opinions that are going to change that. I mean, as I read Janice's question, it's also about different kinds of roles. In many ways, I think some of the most useful academics that you would have would be people who do have some kind of firsthand knowledge or understanding about what LGBT people's lives are like, and they may be LGBT themselves or not. That's hard to know, but you would get that kind of influence by talking to people, being in organizations, perhaps being an activist. And I think those folks who go, who are more academically inclined, who go to grad school, are often really the best kinds of experts to work with, not because they've already formed their opinions. It really has nothing to do with that. It's that they understand the context. They know where the questions are being asked in the movement. So I wrote a book, it came out last year, called The Public Professor, and I talk a lot about this, where the important, for academics who want to, so this is looking at it from our perspective, working with advocates rather than the other way around, but from our perspective, one of the most important things is to have that kind of knowledge, and to have the kinds of networks that allow us to get our research into the hands of people who can use it, and for us to be able to put it into a form that's actually useful, which means no jargon. It means, kind of speaking to questions that are important in a particular context, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think you can still be an important and very valuable resource, even if you have, taken stands on these issues. I can tell you when I was in the Prop 8 trial, people, asked in other kinds of contexts, I've been asked, are you a lesbian? Like, that's an easy answer. Yes. Does that sort of inform what determines my opinion about these subjects? And I can say no, and point to the work that I've done that's been reviewed by other members of my profession who said, this is good work, should be published. All of our work goes through this kind of peer review process, or most of it does. And, so that legitimacy has an external kind of source. It's not completely negated by the fact that I'm a lesbian, or it's not negated by the fact that I have opinions about these subjects.
Thanks, Lee. Michael, tell us about who an expert is.
Okay. I think that what Lee said is really basically what I wanted to say too, because I think that the point is that what makes an expert is the fact that they bring something to the table that other kinds of people don't bring or can't bring. And I've been using the term expert capital, so it's a kind of resource, and the value of that capital, expert capital, depends on the degree to which the person who brings it can maintain the perception that their view is grounded in research and is professionally recognized, rather than grounded in, say, their desired outcome for whatever legal question is under discussion, or their own personal background, whether it be religious or sexual or racial or otherwise. So an expert is somebody who can successfully mobilize that expert capital. And of course, who counts as an expert also depends on the context and what the requirements of that context would dictate about who or what is a good expert. So like what Lee said, typically we think of experts as people who have some kind of specific professional credential or diploma, people like academics or professionals. Now, some institutions like courts actually have specific rules about who counts as an expert. So in general in the US, you probably already know that there are rules laid out under the Federal Rules of Evidence that determine the kinds of things that judges need to take into consideration when deciding if what they're hearing on this stand qualifies as expert testimony and meets the standards of expertise. In these key same-sex marriage trials in the US, lawyers on both sides really worked very hard to find people with the best credentials, people who had great jobs at excellent universities with long track records of publishing in their fields and that had won awards from their respective professional organizations. Now, in other places and in other different decision-making institutions, the rules about who counts as an expert can be different and depend on the perspectives of the people who are involved. So, for example, in French legislatures, where there aren't any rules about what counts as an expert, most of the decision, and it's in these legislatures where most of the decisions about same-sex marriage and parenting are made in France, the lawmakers that set up the hearings that I interviewed described to me how they invited experts not because of their credentials, but because these experts were people who were famous, people who had been on TV a lot, people who had written lots of editorials. France has a long tradition of what we might call public intellectuals, which we don't really have in the US. So these are academics and professionals, but what really matters is their fame than the quality of their publications, because in many cases these were experts who'd never actually published about LGBT issues at all, but they were like the most famous anthropologist in the country, and so having that most famous anthropologist in the country provide testimony brought a legitimacy to the process. And so in this case, what was valued wasn't necessarily their science or their capacity to mobilize science, but their status as a celebrity. So also, what counts as an expert can depend on the kind of information that is necessary or that's useful in a context. So the most common type of expertise in general, whether it was in France or in the US, I found that it was legal expertise provided by law professors or practitioners of law, because most decision makers want to have information about the legislative history or specific juridical details that they can rely on to make their decision. But then beyond legal expertise, there's a lot of variety. In the US, whether it be in courts or legislatures, often psychologists, psychiatrists, economists, sociologists, and sometimes historians. Now in France, unlike in the United States, there's a lot of reliance on psychoanalysts and on anthropologists. And though they're absent in the US, they're important in France because they have traditionally been more involved in shaping French family law over the decades. And so that's just been embedded into the decision-making structure. So in any given national context, who and what counts as an expert is really going to depend on the history and the political institutional structure. On the question of independence, I really think it's important, so this is again dovetailing on what Lee said, to think about experts as people who are dealing with the norms and expectations of their specific professional fields. So experts are independent in the sense that what they're worried about is publishing strong research in good journals, getting grants, getting professional recognition. And those goals are different and distinct from the goals of advocacy organizations. Sometimes those goals can be aligned, but not often. So it's important to think about the logic of what experts are, what their logic is. Now, judges and lawyers are really interested in the degree to which experts have been involved in social movements, because being involved in social movements can give the perception that the opinion they're giving is not really expertise, but is in fact some kind of bias. Now, in courts where lawyers and judges can actually demonstrate and use the rules of evidence to talk about whether or not an expert is concretely biased, and we saw lots of discussion about this in the trial that Lee was involved in, and in others where lawyers on both sides tried to point out how experts on the other side were somehow biased, whether it be because of their sexual identity or whatever. So one of the ways that you can try to demonstrate bias is by saying that a person is involved in the social movement. And then experts will try to shield themselves from those accusations by using the fact that their opinion is grounded in the scientific method. Now, in other forums, like in legislatures or in the media, it's more difficult to, the rules about how you undermine someone's legitimacy or how you shore up your own legitimacy as an expert are not as clear, but typically it does come back to demonstrating that what one thinks is based on what one has learned because of the research. On the question of which expertise is valued, this kind of gets back to what I was saying earlier, and that different institutions value different kinds of expertise for specific reasons. In courts, the kinds of expertise that matter will be because of whatever legal question is under consideration. So, for example, lawyers in favor of same-sex marriage in the United States really wanted to demonstrate that gay people constitute a suspect class, meaning laws that affecting them deserve a higher degree of scrutiny. So lawyers who wanted to demonstrate that gay people created this suspect class called on political scientists, historians, and others in an attempt to show that the history and political science data supported this claim that gay people met the criteria of a suspect class. But in legislatures, sometimes the kinds of expertise that is valued is not necessarily about the legal questions, but is about what gets attention or about what can inspire lawmakers to vote for or against what one wants. And sometimes the most valuable kind of expertise is actually about people talking about their concrete experiences, their own families, their own histories, or the families of the people that they know. And then if you can use social science to back that up, that storytelling can be effective. So can a non-academic be an expert? I think that really just depends on the context and what the situation is. There are actually specific roles for non-academics being kind of like experts. For example, in the Hollingsworth versus Perry trial, Helen Zia was called to the stand to testify. Now, she wasn't actually classified as an expert witness. She was classified as a lay witness. And she provided, testimony about what it was like having been married in the brief window before Proposition 8 in California passed. And so there really can sometimes be a space for information that's non-academic expertise. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thanks. And so let me try to move on to the next slide, and my window's not being responsive here. But the next slide asks for considerations for advocates. And there we go. I realize a lot of these things have been answered again, so you can kind of skip through this, and we actually are running a little later than I thought. So, Lee, why don't you tell us about some of your thoughts about what, from an advocate's perspective, we need to take into consideration?
Yeah, I would say the key thing is what I tell professors, scholars, if they want to get involved, is to have a broad network that includes people who are advocates or people who are in the legal field or the business field or whatever it is that you're trying to influence. So for advocates, it's the same thing. Get to know scholars who might either be somebody you'd work with or who can connect you with the right person. Because I'm sometimes asked that as well. Do you do research in, related to family well-being? And the answer is no, only maybe the economic side, but here are the people who've studied, child well-being or who have other kinds of expertise than mine. So we can, some scholars are hubs, I guess, for a network in that sense. If you really like doing research, you can go onto the form of Google called Google Scholar and type in, topics. If you want to try to find people who are doing that kind of research, you can talk to people who might be in your organizations who are students or have been recently and might be more familiar with the landscape of particular professors and scholars. But I think the other thing that I'll just say very quickly is, think about this as a long-run proposition. We need to build relationships with each other so that we can work together well. We have to understand each other. We have to understand the cultures that we work in. And most professors, if you ask them to do a piece of new research, are going to say, I'd be very happy to do that as soon as I'm done with this other project. Oh, that's nice. When will that be? Come back to me in 2 years. So sometimes you have to think about this sometimes as a very long-term kind of process. You want an answer next week that we might not be able to provide, but probably in many cases you need it next week, but it'll turn out a year from now. That information will still be useful. So, or even 2 years from now. So I think don't shut off the possibility of getting scholars to work with you just because they're busy right at the moment. So build relationships, take the long-term perspective.
Michael, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Lee there on that. Something I could add too is that definitely the first thing you could do is go to the professional organization, this is particularly true in the United States, but go to the professional organization for whatever you think might be good information for you. For example, if you're interested in whether or not psychological data could help you make a claim, then go to the website of the American Psychological Association. Most associations, especially the APA, have entire policy wings devoted to connecting advocates with relevant experts that can help them answer their questions. So go to the organizations. That can be a good place to start, and cultivate relationships with think tanks and also with individual academics. So I can't stress this enough with what Lee said, is that in some places, professional organizations are pretty weak, when that's the case in France. And really, it's about developing one-on-one personal relationships with individual experts. And there are plenty of examples to back this up. So in France, for instance, in the late 1990s, the LGBT Family Association, the APGL, there was basically no research on LGBT families in France until very recently. And so the president of the APGL wrote a letter to every single sociologist in France who had already done research on families and said, hey, listen, I'm the president of this organization that has all of these members, people who are raising children. We would love for you to study us. Would you be interested in doing some research on LGBT families? Of course, she got plenty of refusals, but she got a couple. people who said they were willing to come. And that started a slow relationship that over the decade has really developed into a strong production of research on LGBT families in France. And all of that came from an advocacy organization really going out of its way to reach out to a bunch of different experts. Let's see. The question of the boundaries between expert and advocate, this gets back to what we were talking about earlier, and you want to think about the fact that the experts that you reach out to definitely will be thinking about this boundary and how they can navigate it. So you might expect some wariness. People would think, you know, I'm not an advocate, I'm just here to produce research. And so if you can approach them saying, of course, I'm not asking you to be an advocate, I'm asking you to use the science to provide me with information that may or may not be useful in the long run. So yeah, don't be surprised if sometimes you get refusals because of that, negotiating that boundary. But in general, I would agree with Lee that the people who I interviewed who were experts, almost all had been contacted by advocates at some point and generally responded positively.
Thanks, Michael. And Lee, I'm going to ask you to respond to both of the last two slides. One is, any thoughts about responding to opposition experts? And do you have any particular examples of your having been an expert that might illustrate some points here?
Yeah, so that is, I think, a really helpful role for academics in some situations. In the context of litigation, I think it's quite common. So in the Hollingsworth v. Perry case, the California Prop 8 case that Michael mentioned, I was an expert witness. The other side briefly retained an expert witness. I think they asked him to critique the reports that I was writing, because these are my expert opinion was written down, so that it could be submitted to the court. So he critiqued mine and I critiqued his. I'll just say, in the end, they did not put him on the stand. In fact, I know this guy, not very well, but I know him, and he said, they asked him for his opinion, and then they just sort of dropped him like a hot potato at some point, I think. I like to think that was because I showed that his argument wasn't very strong. It wasn't, and still is my opinion. So that's a context where I think you wouldn't have seen that, but that was an important role that we played, and I think that probably happened for some of the other experts as well, and that may be why, in the end, the other side really did not have any credible witnesses, expert witnesses to offer. They had two testify, and both were, I believe the term is impeached. The other thing that I will mention is, if you're thinking about this in other kinds of contexts, actually, I got into this research to debunk a very popular myth about LGBT people being particularly affluent. I call it the myth of gay affluence, that they've got lots of money, they've all got good jobs, they've all got fancy cars, nice houses, blah blah blah. And I thought this was an interesting puzzle for me. Like, that makes no sense. None of my LGBT friends live lives like that. None of the studies of discrimination based on race and sex show that there's a benefit to having that kind of status. So why would LGBT people be the only ones benefiting from it? So that led me into this research, partly to debunk that myth, which I did by finding better data that showed that actually LGBT people, men in particular, earn less than heterosexual men. But the problem, so that was kind of useful, I think, in a lot of ways, and the myth continues. The challenge is to know how much to talk about it. Sometimes you have to talk about it because it's so prominent, like the myth of affluence, or because a couple of years ago, a study done by a sociologist named Mark Regnerus, at the University of Texas, claimed to show that children raised by lesbian or gay parents were actually damaged and harmed when you look at a longer view, and that got a lot of attention, and so a lot of scholars banded together to, especially in the sociology field, banded together to discredit that study. There's a lot of evidence that they did that study only because they knew that this was going to be an important issue if the issue of marriage equality ever reached the Supreme Court. And so those scholars wanted to have a study that, went against that huge body of scholarship that Andrew mentioned earlier. So that was important, to take a very big public stand. But sometimes you have to be careful, because there is communications research that shows that the more you repeat something, the more people believe it. So if you keep repeating something that you think isn't true, you run the risk of, not debunking it, but just, embedding it in people's brains. So I think there is a kind of a fine line that you have to think about somewhat strategically when thinking about opposition experts or debunking other studies. So I'll stop there and see what Michael has to say.
Michael, you probably have the last word, but only a few minutes.
Yeah, no, I don't want to take up too much time. I would have totally agree with what Lee said, and the example I would have used about how to respond to opposition experts is this example of the Mark Regnerus study, because it really demonstrates a strategy that can work. I think one thing that it shows is, so I won't repeat the story since Lee said it, but what it shows is that there are two ways in which this kind of expertise coming from those who do not support same-sex marriage or LGBT rights in general, one of those mechanisms is to let the experts themselves take care of it using the mechanisms of their disciplines. So in the case of Regnerus, many of the mechanisms that were used were the scientific mechanisms. So let's look at the way in which the research was published. Were the methods concrete? Were the conclusions? Could you draw those conclusions that Regnerus drew based on the data that he gathered? So really taking apart the science and examining the science critically. So focusing on the production of the information and its value or lack thereof is a good strategy that the experts themselves can do. And then in the court, what happened is that then the judge had to make a determination about the value of that science as well. And then in another trial, in DeBear v. Snyder, the judge made a determination that based on what he had heard from the experts or from the evidence of the study, that it was really not as good as it had pretended to be, and that the reaction of sociologists and the way in which they deconstructed the argument made clear that this claim was not really grounded in the data. So that was the way in which the court dealt with it. So that's one way in which you can deal with opposing experts. The problem is that sometimes it doesn't matter whether or not it's good science or not. Once it's out there, then it can circulate. And so then you have to think about what other strategies are. Whether or not you could, I think one strategy to avoid, if I had to think about it, is the strategy of trying to debunk an expert because of their stance. Maybe they're opposed to same-sex marriage because they're Catholic, which is the case of Regnerus. But rather than attacking Regnerus because of his Catholicism or his involvement with the Catholic Church, it's more important to use to critique the value of the expertise because of its weakness in terms of the data. And the reason I say that it's better to focus on that is because if advocates for LGBT rights open themselves, attack their opponents in that way because of their personal status, then it opens up experts in favor of LGBT rights to the same critiques, like, well, if I can't say my opinion as an expert just because I'm Catholic, then why should someone who's a lesbian or someone who is raising children as in a same-sex couple be able to say their opinion? So as much as we can, it's good to focus on the data itself and the value of the expertise rather than on the status of the people, I think, but that's just my opinion. One of the lessons I take away from it, and I'll end there, is that there really is an arms race for the production of information of various qualities. And so there are experts on the other side that are working very hard to produce information of not necessarily good quality, but just to get it out there so that it can be used. And so if we can do our best to encourage the production of expertise that we agree with, or at least expertise that we hope will support our claims, then that can be a good strategy as well. So on there.
Thank you very much, Michael. This has been kind of a very basic introductory conversation about what are experts and their role. Ali Journo brings up, I think, the next set of questions, which is the grassroots versus elite tension over use of experts. When should experts be involved? When should lawyers get involved? Who determines legitimacy? Who leads processes that involve experts? We will hopefully will get into those questions in future discussions on some way, maybe a webinar. But for now, I want to thank everybody for attending, and have everybody have a good weekend. And also,
thank you for the invitation.
Thank you to Lee and to Michael. Okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Oh, Andrew, can I just make one last point? I wanted to say that if anybody does have follow-up questions, you can feel free to email me. If you look on Google, you'll find my email address. And if you have a burning question that you think I could respond to, don't hesitate to ask. So.
Great.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The conference has been muted.